Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we begin a three-part look at the Beach Boys' recorded work released in the year 1986. And as I usually do with these kinds of episodes, I put some of the new and notable releases of 1986 in these three cubicles. In this case, these are records that you might have seen prominently on display in a record store had you walked in on the day of release, July 7th, 1986, to pick up the new Beach Boys compilation, Made in USA. And before we talk more about this, I wanted to mention in recent episodes, we've talked a lot about 1986 popular music, the top 10 singles and the top 15 albums. And in a lot of viewer comments, viewers have espoused the opinion that music was kind of hitting the skids in 1986, and that a lot of the popular music was frankly pretty terrible. And having researched these episodes, I was certainly reminded of the same thing. There are a lot of songs now that I can enjoy for their nostalgic value, but very little in the way of very popular music that I would call great or even very good. Other viewers, beginning with Justin Edwards, commenting on US Pop Culture 1986 Part 1, pointed out that the really good music from the time wasn't hitting the heights of the chart, but was known and regarded well by critics and by those with a keen interest in pop rock music. It was not really the era where we would call this new wave anymore. That was kind of a passé phrase by 1986. Terms like alternative and indie hadn't really come into currency yet, so we call these college rock. Now, of the really popular American bands, Minneapolis, Minnesota's The Replacements didn't release an album in 1986. Their album Tim had come out in November of 1985. It would continue to grow in popularity and gain them new converts until the release of their next album, Pleased to Meet Me, in June 1987. Also very big at the time, another American band from Athens, Georgia, REM, would release their album Life's Rich Pageant on July 28th. They were a band that had started strong and continued to get better with just about every release, culminating in their Imperial phase in the early 90s. Talking Heads released their album True Stories on September 15th, featuring songs from the David Byrne film of the same name. English bands, of course, continued to be very popular and to draw some great critical response. Released on February 21st, Elvis Costello's King of America, another album with America in the title from this period, was released to very high critical praise. For me personally, it was an album that I found easier to appreciate than to really enjoy. There's certainly some great stuff on it, but Elvis Costello seemed to be getting kind of overly complex at this point, and there was nothing here that really struck me on like a visceral gut level the way his first four albums had. A follow-up, Blood and Chocolate, will be released on September 15th to considerably less critical fanfare. Depeche Mode released probably their strongest album yet in Black Celebration on March 17th, and while The Cure didn't release a new album in 1986, their 1985 album, The Head on the Door, remained popular, and a singles collection, Standing on a Beach, allowed fans to fill in some gaps in their back catalog collections when it was released on May 6, 1986. The Smiths were really hitting their stride with the release of The Queen is Dead on June 16th. This would probably be my choice for the album of the year for 1986, along with maybe some of the other things here, or possibly Paul Simon's Graceland. But this was a very, very strong album from the Smiths. A group composed of former Bauhaus members, Love and Rockets, released their sophomore album, Express, on September 15th. And on October 27th, XTC released what is generally considered to be their finest album, the excellent Skylarking, which seemed to draw influences and inspiration from the Beach Boys' Friends album and from the Smile Project. There was also a roots country scene popularized by the likes of Steve Earle and Dwight Yoakam, and much else going on. So this should at least serve as a reminder that 1986 was not all Whitney Houston and Stacey Q. 1986 was certainly not a stellar year for the Beach Boys. There was no new album to follow up from 1985's The Beach Boys album. There were two singles. Of the four sides of those singles, one was a previously released live track, another was a reworking of an earlier song, there was a cover, and only one song that could really be called a new original Beach Boys song. Both of the singles would chart, neither one of them would break out of the bottom half of the Hot 100. If it was any consolation, the Beach Boys were far from the only big act of the 60s and 70s that were struggling to connect in the mid-80s. And it wasn't just a lack of commercial success either. Many of the artists who had been big 10 or 20 years earlier were releasing some of the albums that are still considered among their worst all these years later. For example, we had talked about the Rolling Stones' Dirty Work album, which was released on March 24th. For a lot of fans and critics, the Stones had sort of been circling the drain ever since the Some Girls album in 1978, with each album getting progressively worse after that, with the exception probably of 1981's Tattoo You, which benefited from them raiding the vaults for some unfinished tracks from the mid-70s. Though it had a couple of passably good tracks, for many, Dirty Work was the Rolling Stones' low point, with 80s synthesizers sitting uncomfortably on tracks trying, very unconvincingly, to remind us how tough and edgy the group is supposed to be. Still, it was a commercial success, going all the way to number 4. 1 week after the Beach Boys' Made in USA collection, Bob Dylan will release Knocked Out Loaded. Apart from the 11-minute Brownsville Girl co-written with Sam Shepard, the album was pretty much universally panned. In his book, Chronicles, Dylan admits to not being sure what kind of records he wanted to make in the mid-80s or whether he wanted to continue making records at all. Though his prior album, 1985's Empire Burlesque, and the follow-up, 1988's Down in the Groove, aren't much loved either, Rolling Stone, among others, still rank Knocked Out Loaded as the very bottom of the Dylan barrel. On July 28, 1986, Neil Young will release Landing on Water, which Rolling Stone called an eager-to-please Aldo Nova imitation. If not the very worst of his albums, this one is considered very close to the bottom of the barrel. 3 years earlier, his label, Geffen, had famously sued him for turning in unrepresentative and uncharacteristic albums. Whether his wild swings in style in the 80s were due to a lack of artistic direction, or him just being ornery old Neil Young, remains a topic for debate. In November, Elton John will release Leather Jackets, which he'll later call the least favorite album of his career, and the single, Heartache All Over the World, the worst song he ever recorded. Most fans and critics would have agreed at the time, and time has done little to improve that impression. Elton says the production team and players did the best they could, and blames himself, his mental state, and substance intake for the disastrously poor album. It'll reach US number 91 and UK number 24. Paul McCartney's Press to Play album will be released on August 25th. This is his first completely new album since Pipes of Peace back in 1983, which was a long time by his standards. And incidentally, this is the first CD I ever bought. There was a bonus track on this that was unavailable anywhere else, so as a McCartney completist with my back to the wall, I had to break down and buy it on CD, and then buy a CD player so I could hear it. Press to Play was far from terrible, but it seemed disjointed and unfocused. You got the feeling he didn't really want to make this album. It was just time for his next record. He seems to have muddled through, unsure of what he wanted to do, and feigned enthusiasm for the record that he came up with. This will become McCartney's poorest selling album to date. It'll reach number 30 in the US, though it will get to number 8 in the UK. And it'll be 3 years before he follows up with another all-original new album, Flowers in the Dirt, in 1989. David Bowie's only released work in 1986 were appearances on a couple of soundtrack albums. His prior album, 1983's Tonight, had been poorly received, and in 1987, the follow-up, Never Let Me Down, will arguably fare even worse. The songs are often drowned out in giant 80s drums and squealing guitars. It's one of the first times that Bowie seems to not be setting trends, but rather to be constrained by them. He seems to want to go edgier than on recent albums, while carefully keeping a commercially viable 80s sound, walking the line that satisfied pretty much nobody. It's still regarded as one of his worst albums, although I recently gave it a listen for the first time in years and found it not great, but much better than I remembered. It might actually be time for a slight reassessment of this album. In any case, the Beach Boys were in good company, being confused and unsure of their direction in 1986. After the Beach Boys album in 1985, I kind of thought they'd be returning to their late 70s, 1980 routine of releasing about one album per year. Of course, it was not to be. It was clear even at the time that they were struggling with the direction and with new material, so it's probably actually kind of a good thing that they didn't do a forced album the way some of their contemporaries were doing. The first Beach Boy release of the year came with Rock and Roll to the Rescue, a single released on June 9th. It was written by Mike Love and Terry Melcher and produced by Melcher. Of course, Mike and Terry had written last year's moderately successful Beach Boys single Get You Back and would collaborate on a bunch of other songs for the Beach Boys in the late 80s and early 90s, including Kokomo with John Phillips and Scott McKenzie. Having departed CBS after last year's The Beach Boys, it was kind of a surprise to see the Beach Boys back on the Capitol label after 17 years. Like virtually all other major label singles in 1986, it was accompanied by a video. The group, including Brian, had shot a Fun in the Sun video for the song at Venice Beach on May 29th. Like a visit from old friends, it was nice to see the group in a video, and it was especially great to see Brian looking so healthy in 1986. Apart from that, the video is almost a completely generic exercise in hitting all the Beach Boy cliches of sand, surf, hot cars, and bikini models, with the styles a little updated for the 80s. There was some sort of retro coolness to those earlier tropes in the 80s. It hadn't been that long since the Stray Cats had had major success with neo-rockabilly, and around the same time, Fast Times at Ridgemont High had reintroduced surfer dudes as part of modern Americana. More recently, Springsteen and Aretha Franklin had been singing songs with heavy car imagery. Soon to become a successful franchise, the first Johnny Rockets 50s-style diner had opened on trendy Melrose Avenue on June 6th of 1986. It incorporated the Googie-style architecture of the 50s and 60s that had come back into vogue. That Googie revival style was reflected in the graphics on the Rock and Roll to the Rescue picture sleeve. So maybe, just maybe, there was room in 1986 for an updated, modern, retro-futurist summer fun song from the Beach Boys. Still, I can't tell you how out of touch and never going to be a hit in a million years this seemed to me, just based on the title and the graphics when I first came across it in 1986. The sleeve seemed anonymous and the title bereft of inspiration. As I've said before, while most great rock bands have a decent song about rock and roll, unless you're Chuck Berry, Kiss, or the Ramones, if you've written a song about rock and roll, you probably want to think very carefully about it. Most of the time, it just sounds like you've run out of ideas. I think for most people, this was just like, yeah, that's the Beach Boys doing their Beach Boy thing, and why bother with the new single when you'd heard it all 20 years before and probably much better? I wish I could report that once you put the single on, it defied those expectations, but it really didn't. Lyrically, it tells the story of a shy teenager who, it happened, was looking through his mama's things, which is probably something I'm glad they don't elaborate on. He finds his mama's rock and roll 45s, which inspire him to lose his inhibitions and become the singer of a rock and roll band that 50,000 people come to see every night. I'm not sure how many people picked up on the narrative there. It's pretty hard to hear. What comes across mainly lyrically is the chorus. I can get behind a lyric like, "Hail, hail, rock and roll, deliver me from the days of old," or "It's been a long time since I rock and rolled," or "Long live rock, be it dead or alive," or even "I want to rock and roll all night and party every day." To me, the chorus, "Rock and roll to the rescue, I said it rescued me, it'll rescue you," just seems kind of limp. It doesn't help distinguish the song or make it memorable. At best, it's just kind of a workmanlike, generic lyric. Musically, I like the record much better. It does rock for a Beach Boys record, especially on the verses. I like the hook in the first line of the chorus, "Rock and roll to the rescue," but I think the chorus gets a little weaker at the end with the "it rescued me and it'll rescue you," which to me undercuts the impact a little bit. People had complained about the 80s sound that Steve Levine brought to the Beach Boys' 1985 album a year earlier. It was subtle compared to the overwhelming gated drums and treated vocals on Rock and Roll to the Rescue. This might be the most 80s sounding record they ever made. I do like the fact that you pretty much get to hear each member of the group on vocals. Surprisingly, for a Mike song, he doesn't take a lead vocal, but I enjoy him on the "Hey Now" backing vocals, which are pretty cool and make the record a little more robust. I also like the rock piano and strummed guitar flourishes. I wish we could hear those bits a little better over the giant 80s drum sound. Overall, it's a clear attempt to translate the Beach Boys' 60s style, or some cartoon version of it, into the 80s. A few decades later, we'd call it reimagining or rebooting the franchise. The single is no addition to the pantheon of great Beach Boy records. I don't even think it compares all that favorably to any of the singles they released from the Beach Boys' '85 album. I appreciate the fact that it's unpretentious and not trying to be anything more than it is, which is a mildly fun summer single. The single will go to number 68 on July 19th, making it kind of a modest success, I guess. It'll get all the way to number 33 in Holland. The B-side, Good Vibrations, is from Beach Boys 69, which is what Live in London was called when it was released in the US in 1976. I'm guessing this was chosen because it was a live track that Capitol already had, and it might help generate interest in seeing the group in concert during their summer tour. On July 7th, about a month after the single was released, the Made in USA collection was released on Capitol. It contained 23 tracks with the usual hits from Surfin' Safari through last year's Get You Back in almost chronological order, plus 2 new tracks produced by Terry Melcher. In an era where there were lots of albums with America or USA in the title, this was another one. We're getting into the period now where they're billing themselves as America's band, so it was kind of predictable. We'll talk more about that later. As with the single, the graphics are in the hot mid-80s Googie revival style, and the cover collage is, appropriately for the title, a collection of Americana Beach Boys style. I'm sure their tour sponsor, Sunkist, was happy that they got that orange on the cover. The straw in the woman's mouth is even pointing at it. Suddenly, I'm really thirsty for an orange soda. That's weird. The gatefold features liner notes from the inimitable David Leaf, offering a paragraph on each track that, taken together, give an overview and an introduction for the uninitiated into the history of the Beach Boys. It's one of the many repackagings of Beach Boy hits over the years that I found inexplicable. Now I realize that, at the very least, these are useful for bringing a few new Beach Boy fans into the fold. I'm sure there are some hardcore Beach Boy fans out there who got started and learned about the Beach Boys when they bought Made in USA. And if that's you, I'd love to hear about your experience, so please comment. Coming in 1986, the album had another angle. It was the first Beach Boys hits package initially released on CD. This would have been a hot selling point at the time for those who already owned a CD player. The Beach Boys' back catalog, of course, had not been released on CD. This would have been an opportunity to hear some of the Beach Boys' greatest songs in the sonically perfect compact disc sound that everyone was raving about. Initially, I was really annoyed with the release. Rock and Roll to the Rescue, of course, had been released as a single, but for a completist like me, you still needed to spring for an entire double album to get the one previously unreleased track. That, of course, changed on September 1st, when California Dreamin' was released as a single. We'll take a break here and we'll pick up with California Dreamin', talk about it in depth next time. Then we'll talk about another couple of very obscure Beach Boy releases from 1986. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it went a little long. I'm really interested in your feedback, particularly your takes on Rock and Roll to the Rescue. Was I too hard on it? Was I not hard enough on it? What do you think? And your thoughts on the Made in USA album, particularly if these were the first Beach Boy releases that you ever bought. I'd really like to hear about that. Thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. I look forward to your comments. Till next time, have a great week. Bye.